The first time I saw her, the entire room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with respect. She walked into the Hartwell Foundation's spring gala wearing a deep emerald gown, her left hand tucked low against her side, fingers curled inward, the skin along her wrist and forearm marked with the kind of scarring you only get from something that almost killed you. Nobody said a word. Nobody had to. I watched 3 different men suddenly need to refill their drinks. Watched a woman pull her own daughter gently by the elbow toward the opposite side of the room. Like proximity itself was contagious. I was 24 years old, wearing a rented tuxedo jacket that didn't quite fit through the shoulders, working the event as a junior coordinator for the catering company. My uncle ran out of a strip mall in Tulsa. I'd begged him for the gig because my mother's hospital bills had eaten through our savings the year before, and overtime at a black tie event in downtown Tulsa paid better than anything else I could find on short notice. My job was simple. Keep the trays moving, keep my head down, don't be noticed. But I noticed her. Margaret Ashworth Hale. I knew her name because it was printed on the seating chart I'd helped set up 2 hours earlier. Only daughter of Richard Hale, the oil and gas money behind half the skyline downtown. The man whose foundation had just written a 7-figure check to the Children's Hospital where my mother had spent 6 weeks in the ICU. I knew exactly who she was. I knew exactly who I wasn't. She found a spot near the edge of the dance floor and stood there, alone for the better part of 20 minutes. A string quartet was playing something slow and formal, couples drifting across the marble in pairs, and she just stood with her good hand wrapped loosely around a champagne flute she wasn't drinking from, watching everyone else move. If you've ever stood in a room and felt invisible while surrounded by people, you already know exactly what was on her face. Not anger, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from bracing yourself for something every single time you walk into a room, and being right about it every single time. If you believe people deserve to be seen for who they are and not what happened to them, do me a favor, hit like on this video right now, and if you're watching from somewhere in the States, drop your city in the comments. I read everyone. This story matters to me, and I think it'll matter to you too. I wasn't supposed to leave the kitchen staging area. My job that night was trays, not guests, but my supervisor, a sharp-tongued woman named Donna, who ran every event like a military operation, had stepped outside to deal with a delivery issue, and for about 4 minutes, nobody was watching me. I don't know exactly what made me put the tray down. Maybe it was watching my own mother spend 6 weeks in a hospital bed and seeing how people's eyes would slide right past her once the tubes and machines made her look different than she used to. Maybe it was just that 20 minutes is a long time to stand alone in a room full of people who are supposed to be celebrating generosity. I crossed the floor. I felt every step of it. The way the marble seemed louder under dress shoes than it should have been. The way I could feel Donna's voice in my head, telling me to get back to the kitchen. The way I knew that if Richard Hale decided I'd embarrassed his daughter, my uncle's catering contract with the Hartwell Foundation could disappear by Monday morning. I didn't think about any of that for more than a second. I walked up to Margaret Hale, and I asked her to dance. She looked at me like I'd spoken a different language. Up close, her eyes were a pale gray-green, and there was a sharpness in them that hadn't been visible from across the room. Not coldness, just a kind of guardedness, like she was waiting for the punchline. I held my hand out anyway. I don't actually know how to dance, I told her, which was true, but I'd rather look stupid with you than keep refilling shrimp cocktail by myself. Something in her face cracked. Not quite a smile, but close to one. She set the champagne flute down on a passing tray and put her good hand in mine. Up close, I could see what the scarring actually was. Not random, but patterned. The kind that comes from a graft and shinier in places where it had healed. I didn't ask. I didn't stare. I just kept my eyes on hers and let her lead, because she clearly knew the steps better than I did. And within about 30 seconds, it stopped mattering that I was clumsy, because she was laughing. Actually laughing, at how badly I was counting beats under my breath. For those few minutes, I forgot I was supposed to be invisible. I forgot about the rented jacket and the catering contract, and Donna probably looking for me right that second. There was just the music, and the slight tremor I could feel in her hand, finally settling into something steadier, and the way her shoulders had been up near her ears when I first took her hand, and were nowhere near there by the time the song ended. When the music stopped, she didn't pull away right away. She looked at me for a second too long, like she was trying to figure something out, and then she said, "People don't usually do that." "Do what?" Ask. Most people just decide for me. I didn't have a clever response to that. I just told her it was nice to meet her, and that I hoped she enjoyed the rest of her evening, and I walked back toward the kitchen before Donna could catch me standing there a second longer. I figured that was the end of it. A 2-minute dance at a gala I was working, not attending. A story I might tell my mother when I visited her that weekend. Something to make her laugh. I had no idea that a man in a charcoal suit had been watching the whole thing from near the bar, arms crossed, expression unreadable. That man was Richard Hale. The next morning my uncle called me before 8 a.m., his voice tight in a way that made my stomach drop. He told me someone from the Hartwell Foundation had called the office asking for my full name and contact information, and he wanted to know what exactly I had done at that gala, because he'd already lost one contract that year to a coordinator who'd said the wrong thing to the wrong donor. I told him the truth. I'd asked a young woman to dance because nobody else would. He went quiet for a second, and then he told me I needed to call the number back myself, because he wasn't going to be the one explaining whatever this was. I called from the parking lot of the pharmacy where I'd stopped to pick up my mother's prescriptions, my hands actually shaking a little as I dialed. A woman's voice answered, professional and clipped, and told me Mr. Hale would like to meet with me at his office downtown that afternoon if I was available. I want to be honest with you. I assumed I was being fired from a job I didn't even technically work for him. I assumed I'd crossed a line I didn't fully understand, that there was some unspoken rule about catering staff and donors' daughters that I'd violated without realizing it. I put on the only other decent shirt I owned and drove to the Hale Energy building with my stomach in knots the entire way up the elevator to the 32nd floor. Richard Hale's office had floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over downtown Tulsa, and he didn't stand up when I walked in. He just gestured at the chair across from his desk and studied me for a long moment before he said anything at all. Why did you ask my daughter to dance last night? I told him the truth, the same way I'd told my uncle. I said nobody deserves to stand alone in a room like that, not when everyone else is too uncomfortable to do anything about it. I said I didn't know who she was when I first noticed her, which wasn't entirely true since I'd seen the seating chart, but I told him it wouldn't have changed anything if I hadn't known. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he told me something that caught me completely off guard. He said Margaret hadn't attended a single public event in almost a year before last night, that she'd turned down 2 formal invitations to her own father's foundation events, that the gala had nearly not happened for her at all, until she'd insisted at the last minute that she wanted to go. He told me that for 3 years since the accident, she'd watched rooms go quiet around her the way that one had, and she'd built her entire life around avoiding that feeling. And then he told me that this morning, for the first time in longer than he could remember, his daughter had asked him a question about someone other than herself. She'd asked who I was. That conversation changed the direction of my life. Though I didn't understand it yet sitting in that chair, Richard Hale didn't fire me. He offered me a position with the Hartwell Foundation's Community Outreach Division, coordinating hospital visits, organizing scholarship programs for burn survivors and their families. Work that actually meant something instead of just refilling trays at events I couldn't afford to attend as a guest. He told me plainly that the offer wasn't charity, and it wasn't really about me at all. It was because his daughter had smiled for the first time in 11 months, and he wanted to understand why. I learned the rest of her story slowly, over the following months, never all at once, because Margaret wasn't the kind of person who handed out her history easily. 3 years earlier, she'd been driving home from a friend's house outside the city when she came across a car accident on the highway. A sedan that had flipped and caught fire. A mother and 2 children trapped inside. Margaret had pulled the children out herself before the fire department arrived, going back in a second time for the mother despite the heat, despite people screaming at her to stop, despite the explosion that followed seconds after she got the last of them clear. The burns covered her left hand, wrist, and most of her forearm. She spent 4 months in recovery, 3 surgeries, and what she later told me was the hardest part. Watching the news coverage praise her for 2 weeks straight, calling her a hero, and then watching that same coverage disappear entirely, leaving nothing behind except the scars and the way people looked at her afterward. She started coming to the outreach office a few times a week, quiet at first, standing near the back during planning meetings, not saying much. Slowly, that changed. She started speaking up in meetings, She started showing up to the actual hospital visits instead of just funding them from a distance. The first time she spoke publicly again was at a children's burn unit in Oklahoma City, nearly 5 months after that gala. She stood in front of a room of kids who'd been through their own versions of what she'd survived, and she pulled the long sleeve back from her left arm without being asked, and she told them that surviving wasn't something you had to hide to be proud of. I stood near the back of that room, and I'm not embarrassed to tell you my eyes were wet. I'd never seen her do that before. Not pull her sleeve down self-consciously, not angle her body to hide the scarring from a camera, but just stand there, fully herself, in front of a room of kids who needed to see exactly what survival could look like. It wasn't a straight line forward, though, and I think it's important to say that, because most things worth having aren't. A few months later, someone leaked old hospital photos of her online, taken without her permission during her recovery, and the comments underneath were uglier than I want to repeat. I watched her read through them late one night after a bored dinner, her face going still in a way I recognized by then, the same exhaustion I'd first seen across that ballroom floor. I sat with her and didn't say much because I'd learned by then that she didn't want to be talked out of feeling something. I just reminded her of the gala, of the moment she'd chosen to stay in that room instead of leaving the second things got uncomfortable. She stayed. She always stayed after that night. That was the thing about Margaret Hale that took me longest to understand. She wasn't fragile. She'd never been fragile. She'd just been exhausted. And exhaustion can look a lot like retreat if you don't know what you're looking at. Over the following year, the Foundation's burn survivor programs expanded into 3 additional states. Donations to the outreach division more than doubled, partly because Margaret started appearing at events herself, instead of staying behind the scenes, telling her own story, instead of letting other people summarize it for her. And somewhere in between hospital visits and late nights reviewing grant proposals, what had started as something I couldn't even name became something neither of us had planned for, but both of us needed. A year and a half after that first gala, the Hartwell Foundation held its spring event again, same ballroom, same string quartet, same marble floor. This time, Margaret asked that there be no special introduction, no mention of her recovery in the program, nothing staged, just an evening like anyone else's. When the music started, she turned to me first. There were no whispers this time. We walked onto that floor as 2 people who already knew each other, not strangers crossing a divide. As we danced, she leaned in close and told me something I hadn't fully understood until that moment, that for a long time after the fire, she'd believed certain things weren't available to her anymore. Not because anyone told her so directly, but because of the way people's eyes moved past her, the way invitations stopped coming, the way the world quietly recategorized her from person to person who survived something. She told me that night at the first gala had never really been about romance, not for her. It had been about being looked at like a person again, instead of an incident. She told me I'd given that back to her. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and like the video, and if you know someone who's ever felt like they had to hide a part of themselves to be accepted, send this their way. And before I go, I want to ask you something. Comment the word "seen" below if you believe every scar, visible or not, tells a story worth hearing. Here's what that night in Tulsa taught me, and what I think about more than almost anything else from those years. Courage isn't always about running into a burning car, although Margaret did exactly that, and I'll never stop being amazed by it. Sometimes courage is a lot quieter than that. Sometimes it's just putting a tray down and walking across a room when everyone else has already decided it's easier not to. Margaret told me once that she'd never forget that I crossed that floor when nobody else would. The truth is, I never forgot it either. Not because of anything I did, but because of what she taught an entire room, and one nervous catering assistant in a jacket that didn't fit, about what it actually means to let yourself be seen.